All right. Good morning, everyone. We are very excited to be here with you all today on this really interesting and I think emerging space that a lot of folks have started to take notice, especially in the supportive housing and development world. We have some of the top subject matter experts that are going to be sharing some key, not only insights and information today, but I just want to welcome you all to the very interestingly titled, You Gotta Have Faith, Development Partnerships with Faith-Based Organizations. And prior to introducing the panelists today, just want to briefly introduce myself. My name is Jonathan Soto. I serve as the Executive Director of the newly formed Center for Faith and Community Partnerships out of the Mayor's Office. Just recently, the Mayor put forward this center with the idea of supporting faith institutions throughout the city to be able to address issues of housing, health, mental health, criminal justice. And what has happened is that based on interesting partnerships and identifying the underutilized capacity of houses of worship, we've been identifying that many houses of worship throughout the city have two things. They have the desire to serve, but also they have land, whether it's underutilized air rights, underdeveloped lots. And what we've seen is this interesting synergy between the developer world and also the world of faith leaders that are trying to kind of unite and understand how they best can come together to serve the city. And today's conversation will really focus on some of the individuals that have been at the forefront of these conversations. So what I would like to do now is just kind of go through some housekeeping rules. So what we'll do is that each individual panelist will introduce themselves and do their brief presentation. After the end of their presentation, I will ask a couple of guiding questions on their experiences and insights on this new space that's emerging in New York City. And then we'll open up with 30 minutes of question and answer from you all in the audience. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce some of our panelists. So first we have with us, we have Gregory Marr, who is the Executive Director of Leviticus 2523 Alternative Fund. Leviticus is a faith-based charitable loan fund that provides flexible capital for the development of affordable and supportive housing, community facilities such as early education centers, charter public schools, and community health centers, and economic development projects. Leviticus serves low-income households and communities with a primary focus on New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. And then second, who will be presenting with us, we have Greg Marks. We have Sam Marks, who serves as the Executive Director of LISC, NYC, which is the Local Initiative Support Corporation, which serves as a national community development nonprofit that brings technical and financial resources into distressed communities. Sam oversees the New York City operations, including program design, implementation, real estate development, technical assistance, and financing, in addition to public policy functions. Before joining LISC, he was vice president at the Deutsche Bank Americas Foundation and the director of housing development at WEDCO. Prior to that, he founded Breakthrough New York, a youth development organization. Sam attended Brown University, has a master's in public and policy and urban planning at Harvard Kennedy School, and serves on the boards of Supportive Housing Network of New York, who are our amazing hosts for this conference, and at the Center for New York City Neighborhoods Restore, and the Center for Urban Pedagogy. Next, our third panelist today is Richard Nightingale, who is the president and CEO of West Hab. Mr. Nightingale is responsible for West Hab's overall planning, development, and operations. Joining West Hab in 2001, Mr. Nightingale has occupied a wide variety of positions, from direct client service to program management, and along the way, as he puts it, within a week of being at West Hab, I fell in love with our mission and with our organization. And last but not least, we have with us Pastor Kerman Williams, who brings over 30 years of development and consulting experience to his role as founder and CEO of Kingdom Faith Developers, which is a 501c3 nonprofit corporation comprised of over 50 local pastors and churches focused on the development and construction of affordable housing in New York City. Now, without further ado, I would like to present to you our first panelist, Gregory Marr.
Thank you. Jonathan, thank you so much for that introduction. I think I'm just going to speak from here, if that's okay. I can see everybody. There's a close friend of mine in the audience from my college days who will remain unnamed. And he was kind enough to write me a message of encouragement on the back of my placard here that you can't see. And he wrote, and I quote, "Don't screw up." So you know who you are out there. I will try not to screw up. So it's great to be here with you this morning. Leviticus Fund has not been very present at the Shinny Conference in the past until about 3 or 4 years ago when I started to attend. And our activities in New York City have picked up, and I'm really thrilled to be on a panel to talk about faith-based partnerships, and Leviticus itself is a faith-based organization. We were founded in 1983 by 27 orders of primarily Catholic nuns who decided to disinvest any equity holdings that they had in companies that were doing business in South Africa because of apartheid. And they took their holdings from that disinvestment, about $360,000, and founded the Leviticus Fund. So we are a charitable community development loan fund. And we are faith-based in our origins, as I mentioned, but we also are a member-based loan fund, or CDFI, which is really quite unusual in the CDFI world, the Community Development Financial Institution world. We now have 69 members, again, primarily religious communities, who have invested about $4.5 million in us of what's called subvention capital. It's very similar to EQ2 capital, if you know that instrument. It's deeply subordinate, but it is loan capital. And those members elect our board of directors. And we actually had our membership meeting about 3 weeks ago. I will point out that any 501c3 organization, however, can become a member. So if I'm guessing there are quite a number of you out there with 501c3 organizations, if you want to invest with us and get about 4 times what you can get in a bank savings deposit and have your money at work in communities doing good things, you can see me after the panel. Quickly, the goals of the Leviticus Fund are quite simple, and this is from the beginning really, is to achieve poverty relief and social and economic justice. And that has been present since the beginning, as I mentioned. These are values that our members have lived in their own communities for decades, values of service and focusing on those who are disempowered and vulnerable in our society. And that really shapes the Leviticus approach to community development investing. I call the values of our members the stream below the stream. It's really what animates what we do. We don't talk about it a lot, but it's there, and it's the bedrock upon which we operate. And I would say in the last 3 years in particular, I've been on board for about 3.5 years as the executive director, that Leviticus has emerged as a loan fund that is becoming more widely known. We're very flexible. We get to approval quickly. We have a very low fee structure, and we are intensely focused on customer service, and that is really a cornerstone of our new strategic plan. I feel like I have to say this. Now, Leviticus does not discriminate. Well, that's no great shakes to say that. We hope that's the case. But what I mean by that is that we have a scriptural quote in our very name. So one might think that perhaps there's some type of litmus test as to who we're willing to work with. And there is not, irrespective of any particular faith affiliation or no faith affiliation of the mostly nonprofits that we work with, although we do work with for-profits as well. So I mention that because I'm always concerned there may be a lingering misperception. However, if there is a faith affiliation of an organization, we certainly, will consider working with the organization. It doesn't work in the opposite direction either. So, for example, last year we provided an acquisition loan to a mental health services provider in Rockland County called Bekur Chalim, and they serve almost an exclusively Hasidic and Orthodox Jewish population in an area that has significant poverty, where there's quite a bit of need in terms of mental health services in that community. So you can see we provide technical assistance as well as 6 loan types to a range of project types, including supportive housing. In the last 2 years, we've made actually 4 loans to the community builders. We just received an application a few weeks ago, also to the Bridge, 3 loans to Housing Visions, Communal Life for a project in the Bronx, and CC Pop as well. 50% of these projects were in New York City. I think when a faith-based organization, a church or religious community that is holding land, that is considering working with a developer, let's say a for-profit developer as an example, I think the goals will differ sort of quite naturally based upon the nature of the organizations. It may be that the faith community wants new worship space, they want new office space, perhaps affordable housing for congregants and the wider community, facilities such as a new child care center or an FQHC or a community center, or simply, perhaps, a market rate sale of the property. So I think surfacing the goals that exist, in some cases those will be in conflict, early and clearly is really important. Making sure that everyone's clear about what goals they are trying to achieve. If there are goals other than a straight market rate sale of church property to a developer, trying to figure out where the overlap is, or if there's complementary goals. To begin sketching that out up front, where are the intersection of goals, and are they both achievable, or maybe more than 2? From a cost standpoint, a financing standpoint, and an approval standpoint is really key. The faith community itself may have significant internal pressures that are running at cross purposes with each other. For example, the church or faith community may feel they need to clear, if they're selling some or all of their land, they need to clear a certain amount of net proceeds, and that's their goal. And it may be that, they need to find, because they need to find a new home, they need to build a new worship space, and it may be that the sales proceeds are not realistic in terms of what they're projecting. So in some cases also the faith community's future could be on the line. What I mean by that is, this may be, especially with smaller churches and storefront churches, if they own the land, this may be their only shot at fiscally positioning themselves to survive in the future with a smaller congregation. They talk about millennials as being spiritual but not religious in many cases. Many surveys have shown this to be true. Many younger people are feeling less connected to organized religion and less tethered. And so in terms of actual membership and participation in a faith community, I think congregations in many areas of the country, and New York State as well, are seeing their congregations shrink. So this asset that they have could be a way to position themselves financially for the future with smaller congregations and smaller donations. Looking at it from the outside, if you're a for-profit developer and you're seeing this land as this asset that could be repurposed, I think it's important to understand the discernment process that often is not so transparent from the outside, the discernment process within the church or faith community. For many faith communities, the land it's not just land, right? it represents so much more. It's not just about doing a deal. It may be that, in fact, the prospect of selling or repurposing the land is way more relational than it is simply transactional. So consensus building, often the process is, can take considerable time. It's not a straight line. There's a lot of discussion that has to happen internally. There are a lot of voices that should be lifted up and heard. And again, I would say that there's an emotional component often to the prospect of parting with the land. A church may be where congregation members were baptized, where they were confirmed as teenagers, where they got married perhaps, where they planned to be buried, or where they buried family members. It's a place of gathering over many years, a place of solace and peace, of community, of sustenance. So parting with that land can be a very emotional prospect and a wrenching experience. And so the internal process of discerning what that future is for the land, again, it's a process, and not every process is the same, depending on the tradition of the community and the leadership within the community. So does that process have integrity? Are the voices being lifted up and heard within the congregation? So having an outside party which is interested in redeveloping the land, either on its own or in partnership with the faith community, is usually going to be focused more on the development prospects and sort of the fast-paced, focused approach of a developer. So I think acknowledging what I'm calling the soft components of that internal discernment is really important for an outside party that's approaching the community. So not only acknowledging it so it can be tolerated better, I suppose, but perhaps so you can understand and appreciate it better, and maybe even enter into it to some extent with a more empathetic lens. So some joint venture considerations. I think it's important that on a fundamental basis, the principles of the faith community and the would-be developers communicate well and that they trust each other. It's pretty, basic, but it's really important. And are there advisors? Certainly the developer will probably have attorney and consultant advisors, but who's representing the church? Is there a solid level of trust between the parties, as I said, and are there advisors that can sort of bridge any communication gaps? Do they recognize and acknowledge that the other party is bringing something of value to the table? It could be capital, subsidy, expertise, community support, relationships. Is this an unsettled assessment by one party or the other as to what's being brought to the table? Is it being seen a little differently by the parties? If that's the case, then the road to a smooth joint venture agreement could be bumpy. And if the parties are clear on what the other party is bringing to the table, is it being valued properly? Is it commensurate with the role that the party is playing? And then I would say that the roles, once settled, need to be put forth very clearly in an operating agreement. The rights of consent on major decisions hopefully are clear. They're not too narrow or too broad. And again, I think that's where attorneys and consultants who are experienced can be extremely helpful in bringing these two parties that have very different missions together. So a lender's approach. A church or a religious community can rarely develop a complex project, especially in New York City on its own. It's generally not going to meet the lending criteria, even for a flexible CDFI like Leviticus and others. And most churches, as opposed to like a Catholic Charities development affiliate, most churches are not going to have built internal capacity around something that they don't do, which is development. So a lender will be looking to a joint venture structure generally for capital strength, for expertise. It could be a legal joint venture, often it is, or it could be a contractual arrangement. That can pose problems as far as lack of invested capital by the development advisor and a lack of skin in the game. I think mission-based lenders like Leviticus and Lisk are also going to want to know who's watching out for the faith-based organization to ensure its rights are protected. There are enforcement mechanisms if the agreement is not being abided by. Again, a development advisor or attorney could be critical here. And then from a mission standpoint, a CDFI lender will not only care about seeing the supportive housing built, but also the other goals that exist for the faith-based organization, that they're not at risk of not being accomplished, or that the church is not being exposed to unreasonable financial risk in the partnership. So there's a few examples here. One is Shiloh Senior Apartments, which we lent to, which was a joint venture with West Tab and Shiloh Baptist Church. I'm not going to touch on that because Rich is going to go into detail.
Don't steal my thunder, Greg.
Absolutely not. And then we have a couple of examples here with, these were not joint ventures, but faith-affiliated organizations, Catholic Charities, that we made a couple of supportive housing project loans to. Both were in Cortland, New York. And then lastly, we did some faith-based property research with help from the Westchester Community Foundation. There are many religious communities, Catholic nuns and priests that own quite a bit of land in New York State. And we wanted to see how have they decided to basically dispose of or repurpose that land. The median age in many of these communities is now 80 or above, so in another 20 or 30 years, these communities will not have any living members. So we felt as though it would be really important to try to basically pick up the lessons learned and then feed it back out to these communities as they consider their future. So there's no central database repository of how the properties have been repurposed, so we did a lot of research and we came up with 4 categories, and there's profiles of each of these categories and examples on our website that could be helpful, and this is available to anybody. There's also a helpful document on questions to consider before you begin. There's our website, and that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. And please, we're going to have a Q&A session towards the end. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask Greg, please note them down now. In addition, we encourage folks that after the presentation and after the panel is finalized, please come and speak to any of the individual panelists here. Thank you very much, Greg. So next, we have with us who's going to present. It's actually an individual who has really spearheaded this amazing collaboration with faith communities. When I arrived at the mayor's office, one of the first things one of the projects I was able to work on is collaborating with Lisk on this NILOT program. And Sam is going to speak more about it, but it really has been at the tip of the spear of raising amazing interest in the city on this kind of engaging and emerging prospect of faith leaders being able to identify land. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Sam Marks from Lisk.
Thanks, Jonathan, for that kind introduction. It's been great working with the Community Affairs Unit of the Mayor's Office and HPD on this. Lisk is the Local Initiative Support Corporation. We are the largest community development nonprofit in the U.S. With active local sites in 31 markets around the country. I run the New York City local office of Lisk. And we provide technical assistance and financing to the community development sector. We also have an affiliate national equity fund that syndicates low-income housing tax credits. And we work with some supportive housing folks. We've done transactions with West Side Federation for senior and supportive housing, the Bridge. We're talking to SUS and self-help on a couple of things right now. We did a deep technical assistance engagement with Housing and Services. And we work with a lot of community-based nonprofits, community development corporations throughout the city. I would say the arc of LISC has been focused solely on being sort of an affordable housing intermediary and pivoting to a kind of broader mission about supporting local champions and community organizations that are trying to preserve the things about New York City that are in danger of being displaced by market forces. So that includes affordable housing and housing preservation, but also economic development, small businesses, industrial and community facilities, arts and culture. We're sort of looking at all of those things. But today is about the New York Land Opportunity Program. The origins of NYLOP, HPD came to us with a problem, and it was that they had made a lot of commitment in their ambitious housing plan around the 200,000 unit goal to finding every square inch of land in the city limits to build upon. And a faith-based strategy was part of their housing plan. And they were having some trouble getting some traction there. There had been a lot of conversation, a lot of meetings and folks coming together and sharing relationships and best practices, but hard to see transactions coming out of it. So they came to us with this idea, and we proposed a program model to them based on our experience of working for many, many years in neighborhoods with all types of organizations around affordable housing. And I'll go into detail about the program model, but one thing that we felt certain about was that it was going to take a lot of work to get these transactions over the finish line. It wasn't a matter of just having people sort of convene and give business cards. There needed to be a sustained engagement over a long period of time. And that meant that it was going to be both labor intensive and fairly expensive. So I mentioned up here that after we kind of came up with the concept of our program design, we went on a fundraising campaign. The Booth Ferris Foundation was the first set of commitments in, and that was then matched by some of our bank and foundation partners at Deutsche Bank, M&T, Bank United, Santander. TD Bank also increased their sort of annual commitment to LISC for this. Like I said, it was expensive. We estimated, we budgeted that the value of the technical assistance program we were providing was about $75,000 per group. And those are not resources that the groups we're working with have as resources out of pocket. And so we needed to line up those funding commitments. There was a fair amount of relationship development also, just to make sure that we were getting our arms around the right types of relationships. So we spoke a lot with Jonathan Soto in the mayor's office, also with Pastor Williams and the Kingdom Hall initiative. The Brooklyn Borough president has been convening people. The Supportive Housing Network has its own faith-based initiative it's getting off the ground. And the Interfaith Assembly also is kind of working on this issue. So, it's not just the folks on this panel. There are a lot of folks in the city sort of working this issue. So came up with the model, had the information sessions, using that network of folks to kind of fill the room and get the word out. There was a letters of interest and full application process, and we're now in the selection process. So let me go through the actual program model. So one key insight was that, and I think Greg also kind of hit on this, that faith-based organizations are great at what they're good at, which is tending to the flock and managing people's spiritual lives. They're not real estate developers by training and by orientation, and it was not the goal of our initiative to turn them into real estate developers or turn them into community development corporations. We put together a set of trainings and information sessions for a broad audience, but then our program model involved us kind of winnowing it down to a handful of organizations that we were going to work with deeply over a sustained period of time. And to Greg's point about a discernment process and working with organizations that have to get really crisp about what their goals are, what they want to do, what they're able to commit to doing, what kind of internal processes they have around decision making. I mean, this is likely to be the biggest organizational decision that these faith-based organizations are going to make in their recent history, and they had to be able to make those kinds of decisions, have some formality around who has the authority to make those decisions. And so our selection process was geared towards assessing that readiness and helping the organizations come to some self-assessment about whether they were ready. And again, the goal was to have sustained engagement over several months, as opposed to just providing some information and sending folks out. The goals of the program model is to engage in a joint venture partnership with an organization that does development as their bread and butter. Clarity on the faith-based organization's goals and mission. To Greg's point, there's a surfacing process of surfacing the goals of the organization. And in coming up with their joint venture partner, they had to figure out how they could put their own mission and goals core to the process. Many of these organizations are getting calls from real estate developers every day, knocking on their door. Do you want to sell your land? I have a great deal for you. And we want to make sure these organizations are in the driver's seat, that they're not, just responding to the opportunities that come to them, but they're figuring out what they care about, what they want. So this was the first step. We did a number of borough-wide workshops. There were 4 of them in Brooklyn, Manhattan, Queens, and the Bronx. We also wanted to highlight successful models of developer faith-based organization collaborations. And so we had a number of our partners come through: Ridgewood Bushwick Senior Citizens Council, MBD Development Corporation in the Bronx, Bridge Street Development Corporation in Brooklyn. And then we had some for-profit developers also come through who we knew to be really critical partners and good partners to nonprofits. So that included Brisa Builders and Notias. That's a pretty nice shot of you, Pastor Williams, as well. See how I did that?
It was fair.
Oh, and John, Jonathan Soto's up there taking it. This is just one case study. LISC had nothing to do with this transaction, but it was one of the ones that Ridgewood Bushwick Senior Citizens Council mentioned as a great model where it was really a true partnership with a church, where the church had major involvement in every decision regarding this project. It's a really innovative project, a passive house, super energy efficient. Not something that the church might have done on their own, but working with a mission-oriented, innovative developer. And then after the compliance period, the church has the first sort of right of first refusal to purchase the property after the tax credit period is over. And so again, sort of putting the church's needs front and center. So here's where we are. We had our 4 information sessions over the fall. We had 33 letters of interest that came in January. We invited 19 full applications from those letters of interest. And then there were 10 finalists that we really went deep with. And that due diligence happened with our own staff. Arturo Suarez is our housing director. He's got a team of folks who do this kind of technical assistance work day in, day out with our nonprofit partners. So we leveraged the expertise of the housing team. We also brought in Edelman, Sultan, Knox, and Wood architects to do preliminary zoning analysis and get a sense of what each site could reliably yield. And then Goldstein Hall was our legal partner to do some preliminary background checks, look at property legal documents, look at some of the organizational documents of the faith-based organizations to assess their willingness and ability to make these kinds of decisions. And we have selected our organizations. We're not quite ready to make it public yet, but I did see the sheet of paper with all of the evaluation and the check marks next to the ones that we selected, but I'm not going to reveal those today. I will also mention, just on the, since this is the Supportive Housing Network, that part of the analysis was looking comparatively about what each spot of land could yield if you were looking at family units versus studios, one bedrooms, and supportive housing. So the organizations have a really clear choice to make about whether they want to consider going the route of supportive housing. They'll be able to serve more people, but they also need to understand that, you know, going the route of supportive housing means partnering with an organization that has a very unique set of capacities around, not just on the real estate side, but on the service side. And again, you know, I mentioned this is an expensive proposition that required us to do a whole lot of fundraising, because what we want to do is again, like, not just, you know, give a bunch of referrals, but really climb in with these partners and give them a pretty deep dive set of technical assistance. And again, you know, bringing in Edelman Sultan Knox & Wood and Goldstein Hall, you know, they'll do a certain amount kind of pro bono for free, but we had to engage them and set up separate contracts with them to provide these services. I forgot to have a slide with our website, but we do have all of the materials from the trainings, all the PowerPoint decks, all of the trainings we did, you know, videos and everything is on our website. And I will send the link out via Twitter. And if everyone here follows me on Twitter,
very clever.
You can get that link. And yeah, there's a lot of good information there. I just sent it out. So SMarksNYC is the handle. Follow me and get access to all that good stuff.
Fantastic. A round of applause for Sam. And one of the things that we've noted, especially from the mayor's office, is that not only has LISC really and their commitment to engage our partners on the ground has yielded additional interest. But it's broadening the scope of potential engagement and the ideas that available faith communities have to be able to engage in this development process. And it's interesting because our next presenter, who is Richard Nightingale, the president and CEO of West Hab, I just found out that they're engaging in a project with someone that I'm very close here in the room. So that's hyper relevant, the conversations that are happening today. So I'll give it off to Richard, and we'll pull up your slide right now. Great. Richard, take the floor.
Thank you. We hope to be engaging in a project with someone who will remain unnamed in the room. We hope to be engaging in a project with half the people in the room. Very quickly about West Hab. West Hab is headquartered in Southwest Yonkers, or as Shani would refer to it, upstate. We're a fairly big fish in a small pond in Westchester. We're a leading affordable and supportive developer and social service provider. We're very proudly a new minnow in New York City. We just recently completed a 68-unit supportive and affordable building in the Bronx, and hopefully there'll be more of that to come. I think this progression makes sense. Hearing from lenders and folks that have studied this issue, we're going to zoom in a little bit on a project that we completed in this space. Back to Jonathan's opening remarks, there's no doubt there's a ton of opportunity here. I think that affordable and supportive developers and faith institutions that share a will to make something happen and we know that the reason we're here is because so many faith institutions have land. That doesn't mean it's easy, and all of the sensitivities that have been touched upon are very real and need to be navigated, and not just nominally navigated, but sincerely contemplated and worked through as a partnership comes together. I think joint venturing in general, faith-based or otherwise, is something everyone would like to do. It sounds great. JVing is hard. Folks move in different ways, bring different skills to the table. So whether you're trying to produce a mixed income project, whether you're trying to do something with a faith-based institution, I think we all probably know you have many more conversations than any if 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 20 hits and turns into a project that that's great. As was mentioned by Sam, and a theme throughout, a lot of the thought around this space is about protecting faith-based institutions, and we know a lot of those folks are getting that weekly call if they have prime land, not from the wonderful people attending the Shinny conference, but from predatory developers and folks that want to make a quick deal or flash some money at a church or another faith institution. Therefore, I think the opportunity exists for the mission-driven developer, because we can come in and speak the same language. We share in a community mission, and certainly I think for-profit and not-for-profit developers, especially not-for-profit developers, I'll make my plug, who share in mission, have a unique opportunity to work with faith partners and create a lasting partnership. So our partnership that I'm gonna mention here, and then at the end I'll just talk about a couple other things we're looking at, was with Shiloh Baptist Church in New Rochelle. And this was not a redo of the church building, which makes things infinitely easier. I know the main example out there is probably a church that is their land, and the redo is going to be residential over church, and that's some stuff we're looking at now. This is easier because this was on the grounds of. So actually, a neighbor bequested some property to the church. They also purchased an adjacent property and built an assemblage, and they themselves wanted to build some kind of housing, some kind of affordable or supportive. They wouldn't have known supportive per se, but some kind of affordable or community benefit housing. Because that will came from them, we didn't have to come in and sell, you should build a housing project on your property. So again, this is maybe too easy an example. It's not the church building itself, and it's a church that has a will to do something. They would have liked to do it themselves. That's the path they started on, and they hit road bumps and realized that they were not a real estate developer and needed a partner. So really, in a lot of ways, and I'm just being very frank, the partnership with Westhab started as a marriage of convenience and necessity. It's turned into a true partnership and a true marriage of mission, and that's where we've come, operating the building over all these years. So the property, the development that we came up with, I don't have a lot of words on these slides, but I have some pretty pictures, is a 40-unit HUD 202. So the HUD 202 program is deeply affordable senior housing. That was the population that was most attractive to the church. So the fact that we could bring in the HUD 202 award made that possible. It has a number of units that are set aside for frail and elderly. All of the units are adaptable. There's a number of features, for affordable senior housing, such as a lounge on every floor, laundry facility on every floor, a large community room. All of the units in this building are one bedrooms, all with beautiful bay windows. So, we really honored kind of the vision of the church. They didn't want to go down this path if they couldn't do something, that they could be really proud of. So just to mention some of the mechanics of the deal, and I think that's what's most relevant in a lot of ways. So the church formed a CDC, and I know so many have now, so that's a well-known path for faith institutions, and you'll hear more from the pastor. So they already had the land owned by a CDC. The CDC actually entered into a 75-year land lease that we were able to capitalize up front as an acquisition. And I think, 75 years is a great delta. It's plenty for us to be able to go and build housing, but it does make them feel like we're not giving this away forever. The church plans on being around for generations, and so the fact that it was a land lease, but the fact that they could get an acquisition paid into the church as part of that, I think was the best mechanism for this deal to happen. As a nonprofit developer that doesn't have, a lot of cash sitting around, we didn't have to go acquire something, so it still, fulfilled everyone's purpose. The HDFC that was formed to join the limited partnership was a 51% West Tab, 49% CDC controlled HDFC. So we had the 51% majority on the HDFC. We put up the bulk of the guarantees and did all of the development legwork. All of those little details there were super important. As I said, we've become this real true partnership and true marriage. The HDFC meets, still twice a year. We've been operational a number of years now. There is a lot of input from the church side. They've really adopted our tenants and included them in so much. So having the 75-year land lease, having the shared ownership of an HDFC has really been the right, mechanism for us. Just on my pretty picture tour, I'm going the wrong way, so I'm going to go the other way now. This was our groundbreaking, and I'll mention why I included this. It turns out if you partner with like a really thriving Baptist church, you get like a marching band at groundbreakings. Unknown to us, it was really like a very pleasant surprise, and obviously this is a group that had great local will and great connection to City Hall and all of those things. Here is the other end of things, the ribbon cutting. Everyone likes to show the ribbon cutting and the fun stuff, not like the excavation or anything. The reason I would highlight those two is that's the pastor front and center. And I think that's one of the most important takeaways is, as the developer, this is not your project. You're helping, enable a vision. Certainly, West Hab's very proud of this development, and it's near and dear for us. But this was more, as Sam said, this may be their only piece of land, right? And this is where a whole religious life occurs. So this was their dream, was to build this housing. This was 2 decades in the making. Our role in it was the last couple of years of making it happen. So this was their project, and I think that's just, was a critical aspect of things for us. There's the payoff, is some of our folks. So just quickly on future things, we are now looking with Shiloh Baptist Church at an additional parcel that they've come into ownership of. So this must have worked pretty well. We're looking to replicate this exact model with them. And here is a very different piece. The first thing I'll say is a little tangential to housing, and then it'll hit there. This is a old Presbyterian church in South Yonkers. In the upper left there is the facade, Good Shepherd Presbyterian Church, and on the right is this beautiful sanctuary space. This is a church that really had become dilapidated. They have this beautiful sanctuary space. They weren't even meeting in it in winter because they couldn't heat it. And we have been a leading service provider and convener of community stakeholders in this neighborhood for a generation. We own other housing in this community. We deliver food pantry services, you name it. So we've always had a huge, robust community development focus on this neighborhood. The church always wanted to be a 7-day-a-week church community with a thriving mission side of the church. Really, they've, like many faith institutions, came into very hard times. They were struggling to do what they do on Sundays the way they wanted to. So they turned to us and said, why don't you take on the building? We don't know about boilers. We don't know how to put a new roof on this place. Why don't you take over the building for us? And what we want is a free space to worship on Sundays, moving forward. So we acquired this property in a nominal sale to transform it into a community center. And that's why I say it's a little tangential to housing, but we're working on honoring this church's vision by creating a youth and adult education center, largely privately funded. You can see me after if you want to write any checks on this. But the reason I wanted to mention this here is if you look at the bottom picture, it's a church with a very nice sized parking lot, which is super important outside of New York City. And then the parcel on the right side of the screen, we've now acquired so that we can build complementary housing and create a campus. So to create new affordable or supportive housing or both side by side with a community center. So what was a faith partnership really solely on mission is now turning into a housing partnership as well.
Thank you very much. Round of applause for Richard. When I joined the mayor's office, one of the emerging issues in the faith community was that of, as highlighted by Richard, of predatory folks, developers, approaching houses of worship that felt ill-equipped, ill-prepared to be able to deal with this kind of emerging interest in their spaces, especially as land became more scarce throughout the city. Many faith leaders found themselves to be at the kind of forefront of this kind of like aggressive energy that was coming from the real estate world. And one of the individuals that really has rang a bell that cannot be unrung has been Pastor Kerman Williams over at Kingdom Faith Developers. Not only has he spearheaded a lot of this conversation from Brooklyn Borough Hall in partnership with Borough President Adams, but he really has been at the forefront of raising awareness and trying to create an infrastructure, not only at the financing and development level, but also at the community level, so that faith leaders can feel that they're better equipped to deal with this emerging interest. So I'd like to pass the floor over to Pastor Kerman Williams for his presentation, and thank you for being with us here.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you to the network for inviting us. I just would like to begin by saying that I'm grateful for being on the panel and particularly for hearing the presentations of my co-panelists, because I am astounded by the information that I'm hearing. I would only have got to hear that probably in a panel like this, because they don't tell me personally, but I'm astounded by their gift of discernment, which was mentioned regarding houses of worship, and the statistics and the studies that they have. So I just want to say that, preamble by saying that that's very informative to me personally from being here. We're not really an organization. Well, we are now. We kind of have become one, but we were just an initiative initially with a need to get some focus and some information. Approximately 3.5 years ago, well, 3 years ago, 3 pastors, one of which was myself, went to the borough president with the goal. And let me just say that I listened to the technical explanations of this industry. Well, I'm just a local pastor from the block. I'm still trying to gather and garner and understand all of the alphabet soup that goes with the acronyms of this industry, a lot of them starting with the letter H. And
we're trying to still understand that too, just so you know.
I just want to be clear about that. And I'm going to try to be brief because he said a half-hour question, and so I have really about 7 minutes, right? So 3 years ago, myself and 2 other pastors, we heard the mayor's commitment to 200,000 units of affordable housing, et cetera. And so we decided that we would try and go see him and, tell him that we wanted to participate in this plan. Someone advised me that probably I should stop by the borough president's office on the way to the mayor because it wasn't as simple as I thought it was to go see the mayor. So we went to see the borough president with 3 pastors, and what the borough president basically said to me was, I can't take 3 pastors to see the mayor. 10 or 12 maybe, with land. I said, okay, so we put out a call. We scheduled another meeting for 12 days later, and I came back with 26 pastors with land. And at that point, the borough president started to form a housing initiative, and it started to generate something that I don't think was in the original plan. Out of that, we found out that there's so many different denominations that have land, but what they all had in common was a desire to learn about the feasibility of developing their property. And as a result of that, we started to have monthly meetings, which we had for approximately 2 years, just gathering information, bringing in pastors, developers, attorneys, HBD, what's the state? HCR. HCR. What's the other alphabet soup? And bankers and lenders and you name it. And we just had open forums financed by our own selves, paying dues and adding to the membership of of Kingdom Faith Developers, which, of course, it wasn't Kingdom Faith Developers then. It was just us having meetings at our churches, and we would rotate that until it sort of morphed and evolved into the borough president and his staff getting involved with us on a more deeply level regarding capital funding and et cetera for projects, and then him lending us access to his very capable land use staff in the person of Mr. Richard Barrick, who was very instrumental in helping us to kind of put some of the things that we were in control of in some order. And so we started to have forums, and I think we're up to our third potential Building Brooklyn Right Forum, which is where many people that I see in this room attended, and I can hear a lot of the information shared coming out of their presentations, and I'm enamored by that. So that was the annual Building Rights Forum, which I will say that my email now has a forum by someone every week regarding affordable housing, attorneys, everybody. So, and that's great because we need to get more information. So faith-based organizations to kind of connect with some of the discernment that I've heard, we're now in this season being drawn into issues of real estate as they have so eloquently articulated, that wasn't even on the radar of churches and pastors, say 10 or 15 years ago. And then the pressures, most of which have been spoken of, to develop vacant land was overwhelming, which was what prompted us to go and try and connect with the so-called professionals and those persons who had information that we could use. And we were very naive, and to a certain extent still are, regarding the intricacies of development, which also has been stated. We were like the president. We thought that it was easy, and we found out that it's not that simple to do development. You know?
Nobody knew it was so complicated.
Somebody had to know, but it wasn't us. So, and you know, it's a very complex issue, and a lot of the things that I would talk about have already been mentioned, so I don't want to be redundant. The best thing that I can do probably in my presentation is open myself up for questions, which then will only deal with the things that are relevant to you, because after all, I am a preacher, and I can go on and on and on. So we had to get involvement in real estate in a way that no one was prepared for, at least in the pastors that we were dealing with. Some of the reasons, of course, had to do with the shifting populations in our communities and all of the other things that have been mentioned. A lot of stories about shady deals abound in all of our meetings, both our closed ones and open ones, predatory lenders, poor construction, predatory developers. All of these factors contribute to our growth and development over this time, and informing pastors and making them aware. I must tell you that most pastors are very, very leery and skeptical of most of the stakeholders in this industry, whether be it banks, developers, the alphabet soup people, or whomever. Pastors are very leery, and for some of the reasons that have been mentioned, because they have a vested interest in their properties and in their church, and emotionally, and all the rest of the ways that I've heard persons expound on by their discernment. So the first thing that I would say, because one of the things that I was asked to focus on was, as a developer, what do you need to know when approaching and partnering with a faith-based organization? Well, the first thing that you need to know is that pastors are very skeptical of you, period. And my toughest job has been in performing these marriages, pun intended, between the developers and the faith-based organizations that we have been successful in kind of getting to the point of calling them in the pipeline, I suppose, because we don't have a completed project in our efforts yet, but we have quite a few who have potential. So there's this level of trust that has to be built up relative to relationships, and Kingdom Faith Developers has been successful in being a go-between between organizations and churches just to build that, because until that's built after 3 years of doing this without any support or funding, but out of our own pockets, no studies, nobody granting us any funds, what I realize is that that's the greatest hurdle of all, is to get these pastors, or to get us, who, as has been rightly stated, have their whole lives in some instances vested in this institution and this property, to really be willing to let it go, one, and to trust the people they're letting it go to. So there's a lot of skepticism about, we learn new terms like term sheet and the regulations and requirements. And as it relates to supportive housing, which we have not been doing, we have been focusing on affordable housing exclusively. In the short time that I have been pursuing, trying to understand how those marriages are performed, I'm finding out that it gets even a little more complex because of the regulations that accrue to the institutions who perform social services, and then get to develop mixed-use residences along with the churches. So that's like something that we're looking forward to, but we're going to need a lot of training from you to find out how that gets done. There's a lot of different denominations. Some of the issues would be that some of the denominations, unlike others, are not the final say in making decisions about the properties. There's probably dozens of denominations under the Protestant heading of church, and many of them have boards and authorities and organizations and denominational entities that really own the land. So it's not really owned by the pastors. Of course, in the instances like the original group of us, the pastor had like the last say, like the Baptist pastor, he's the bishop, the overseer, the apostle, the prophet, he's all of that.
That's right.
Except being a developer. He's not that. And then all of those processes and learning how, because we kept growing and having those meetings till eventually we had attracted probably at this point 73 houses of worship who have various sizes of land, many of which, of course, are not feasible for development in the under the affordable housing umbrella, but we meet with them and try to continue to encourage them anyhow. Most of the rest of the information I had relative to the challenges, well, let me just name a few in this minute. All right, so it's been touched on that in many, many instances, this property and this mission is all that these pastors have. Many of them have dedicated their life to this development. A project that we're working on now that I had a meeting yesterday, the pastor simultaneously asked me to come and speak at his 50th pastoral anniversary of being in ministry. So 50 years, he's literally been at this church. And I've spent the last year and a half actually trying to get him to see the benefit of developing it. It's quite a substantial plot of land, and the church also needs to be developed. And we finally had to come up with a model that didn't include tearing down the church for the reason that he had no confidence that we would be able to find a place for him to relocate in the interim, which is in most cases the fact. Because if there was facilitation for him to relocate, then land wouldn't be so scarce. So it's kind of a catch-22 in that regard. So many, many pastors, I'll say, right now have not been able to move forward with a development project because of that factor, because they are very leery about what they'll do in the interim, relocating, moving to a different location, and tearing down the house of worship that they've become married to. So that's one of the second greatest hurdles that we face, because of the lack of facilitation to be able to move while the project happens. I would have to say that that's probably holding up about half of the projects to have the potential to go forward.
Interesting. And just for the sake of time, I would like to hone in quickly, and if you could just talk about.
I could get rid of this.
No. Actually, I think that your framing of the decision-making power inside of a house of worship is something that the audience and folks that are interested in developing any type of housing or supportive housing is key. Could you briefly, in 60 seconds, just talk about what is the best way to find out who should I really speak to, or who really has the vested authority in a house of worship to move forward discussions on development?
I could do that in 10 seconds. Call Kingdom Faith Developers.
There we go.
And I'm not being facetious. I'm saying to you that the skepticism and trust level is very, very real. And the reason why we still exist and evolved into an organization versus being personal initiatives ourselves to develop our own property is major, one of the major reasons because of that factor. So we became like a third-party sort of bridge to bring that about. Because it's not a general sort of situation. It's almost as if every situation has its own differences. So there's no boilerplate I can say to you is this is how you do it. I would say that's what Kingdom Faith Developers does, unfortunately, to my chagrin,
Yes.
often. But yeah, that's a big deal.
And I would just add that the questions about kind of trust and how do these different types of organizations, a real estate development organization and a faith-based organization, how do they find the common ground to work together? It's on both sides because we as LISC, as a lender, and some of our partners have been involved in a lot of conversations with faith-based organizations around development issues where they go pretty far down the road with a member of the church or a church leader, and then when it gets time to sign the documents and actually, make the marriage happen, the person they're talking to doesn't have the authority to sign the legal documents, and figuring out who that person is could be challenging. I mean, we've been looking through some of the organizational documents of these organizations, and we understand community development corporations and nonprofits. We ask for their bylaws and their governing documents, and there's differences from organization to organization, but they have similar kinds of legal structures. All the faith-based organizations, they're all totally different. And some of the organization documents are hundreds of years old.
That's the point I am making.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So the answer to your question again, Kingdom Faith Developers.
I would just add too, regardless of who the decision maker is, you'd be foolish not to start with the pastor, because that pastor needs to be your champion. They need to believe in this. Then you take it up and you got to figure out, then you call Kingdom and you figure out the right path. But if the pastor doesn't want to see it done and that's their building first, then you got to figure out the authority,
Well, one of the reasons, when I say call Kingdom Faith Developers, I'm talking about as it relates to people who are part of our structure and our organization.
Definitely.
And of course, if they aren't, then I give them a membership.
Well, I think it's very interesting, and after this question, I'd like to open up questions from the audience, and specifically to Greg. Because of the issue of trust that we've discussed and the need to have a kind of intermediary or an understanding of or what type of exchange must happen between the developer community and the faith community, having Leviticus 25 on your name kind of presupposes or shows that there's some type of commitment to mission-driven development. In your experience, can you speak briefly about how do you engender that trust? What is the first or second thing you try to do in your conversations with people in the faith world that have land to ensure that connection happens in a way that there's this kind of mutuality of interest that's expressed in the engagement?
Well, certainly there are many people of faith who are not working within faith-based organizations, but as you say, because of our name and our origins, there's an assumption that we kind of get it a little bit more in terms of the internal dynamics within a faith community or a church. So we get some free points, I guess, in the beginning, but we still have to kind of earn the trust of an organization, a church, and show that we really respect the process and understand the process. So I would say there's no shortcuts because of the kind of variety of missions, goals, purposes, and approval authority pathways within churches that Sam and Reverend Williams mentioned. You know, Leviticus would also need to really spend a lot of time learning that, understanding that. But I think as, you know, we probably have a little bit more of an inside track as being a trusted partner because we are, you know, more avowedly a faith-based organization.
And now I would like to open up questions to the audience. I see a hand right over here. If you could just state and project your voice towards here.
My name is Kerman. I'm a development consultant, actually specializing in working with nonprofits. I think, first of all, the efforts of the pastor to create a collaboration of fellow pastors with whom you can trust to sort of join forces and reach out to get the education provided by all of these sources is to be commended. So one question, the mayor's office in your, Mr. Torres, your shop is if the pastor's efforts are being replicated in other boroughs, if you think the trust is built through that collaboration first and foremost, having, as I said, worked with nonprofits, faith-based organizations interested in developing, they are very, and my last thing, Richard's point about a plug, HPD does have a list of consultants and construction consultants and other members of the team for faith-based initiative developers to access. So through all of these things, these vetting, the partnership opportunities, but first and foremost, the collaboration of faith-based borough go a long way.
Absolutely. So just quickly, and I think if Sam could just talk briefly about the borough-to-borough model, since we partnered in going to different boroughs to spark this discussion. The owner's representative list, it's very interesting because that list emerged after, and I think, Pastor Williams, you were one of the catalysts in really ringing that bell. And what happened is that I started working with folks at HPD to kind of understand what is the easiest way, or what's the first step we can take in establishing some type of clearinghouse, right, of individuals that are existing in this space, how are they vetted, and ways that we could share this list with faith leaders that may be interested in developing affordable housing. So after much arduous work with Patrick and Alexa Warren over at HPD, and their amazing teams, we were able to put together that owner's representative list. And if you are interested in joining that list or having access to that list,
I'm on that list.
you are, no, generally, of course.
I think maybe that's
Sure.
just, aware that this group, because I don't know that it's marketed.
Sure.
Quite yet hasn't gotten traction, but it is the resource I was mentioning.
Absolutely. So if you're interested in finding out additional information, feel free to connect with me, and I think there's folks here from HPD as well. And then,
We
yes.
have in our organization, because it's not just pastors in our organization, it's also other persons who collaborate with us. So we have probably, I know of personally 5 owners representatives that are part of Kingdom Faith Developers. So we understand, I mean, they're not pastors, but they're part of our advisory, and they're starting to be used, and it's a very necessary component, I believe. And I mean, we were very happy that HPD came up with that. But again, like she's saying, like someone's saying, I don't think again, even with owners reps, there's still a trust problem.
Yeah, it's very true. I see 2 hands here.
Hi, Jordan Press from HPD. I work on the government affairs side, and every now and then on a project that's partnered with faith-based organizations, I'll get a call from an elected official who gets a call from a parishioner, another member of the church, who said they're hearing that there's a development and they don't feel well connected to what church leadership is planning and doing, and that they don't understand. So, and then we're in the position of having to try to get together with developer, church leadership, elected officials, and gets a little messy. Can you talk a little bit, I think you mentioned some of it before, but a little bit more about the conversations that church leadership has with your parishioners when you're embarking on these and, you know, if you get pushback, kind of how you handle that, or if that's not going on in you know, in your own church, what you might recommend to others?
Well, I think that the suggestion that was made by
Richard.
right, is that you start with the pastor, because even in instances where there's a hierarchy above the pastor is considered to be by the community and by the parishioners still, in most instances, to be the titular head of that congregation. And I mean, I've never had an instance where there was a necessity for HPD to intervene relative to the members of the church and the authority of the pastor. That hasn't happened.
How about the pastor bringing the congregation along with the plan, though?
Well, I mean, there's that's determined by, again, the structure and the organizational design of the church. In some instances, the pastor is like the ex-official officer, and I like to say that very proudly. In some instances, and sometimes it's hyperbole, because to be quite honest. And again, there's so many, very many of the churches that had the wisdom to purchase land some time back are churches that don't have the kind of structures that that Sam talked about, that he finds in, say, community development corporations and the like. And as he's also stated, there are some churches that when it comes to the paperwork, you have to dust it off, basically, because they have literally been, see, again, I said something that is very significant, which is even 5, 10 to 15 years ago, we never expected to be involved in the real estate business, which is what this turned out to be. And the fact that you have land doesn't immediately make you conscious and aware of what it takes to develop it. And so, you know, when you don't know, then you're just leery of everyone. But in most instances, unless it's a church that's in a denomination that has a hierarchy over the pastor, pastor has to say.
Any of the other panelists have any insight into that question? Or would like to comment on that?
I think it's a hard place for HPD to be in, frankly. It's really between the congregant and the leadership and the pastor, right? But you can't just give them that pat of an answer. I mean, you know, most churches, even those that don't have that higher hierarchy, still basically have a medieval structure in terms of there's, you know, you're always going to have some people who are not happy with selling land or repurposing it because they've been congregant for 70 years and their parents and grandparents were too, and they don't want a sale for any purpose. And so I don't think there's usually a vote that's taken within a place of worship in a case like this. It's as Rich said, it's an attempt to build consensus, and it's a long process. So I think that a developer, nonprofit or for-profit, that's looking to this precious resource, land, to try to address some of the significant issues in New York City and the state, has to really start with the organization, right? It's not about the deal, it's not about the financing, that comes later, or about what could be built. It's about the organization, and it's the way that it goes about making decisions, and the fact that the pastor is, in almost all cases, going to have the final say. And that's a very different than the CDC, for example, and other nonprofits. It's just the reality. And it's a long timeline usually as well.
I mean, when we stepped into this NILOP program, it was a very iterative process, and it drew on expertise that we had within LISC, both around the technical aspects of real estate development and how you put a deal together, and program design and how you develop a program so that those two pieces can come together. I would say that the technical housing side of our shop was, if I can say, leery, skeptical, all of those things that you said, because of those trust issues and recent history of trying to get things going with faith-based organizations that didn't get to the finish line. So there was a lot of leeriness and skepticism when we started down this road, and it was the program design in terms of starting broad and trying to winnow down to a group of small handful that we feel confident the site will yield something, and through the process, we've gotten to know some of these folks and gotten a sense of their capacity and willingness to jump in. So that's how we kind of mitigated our risk to pour a lot of resources into something that may not go somewhere. And just finally, one other piece that I didn't really stress in my comments but should have is that the selection process around joint venture partners, we're encouraging each of our 5 groups to develop a request for proposals where they put together, we can help them on the technical aspects of what do you have, what's possible, zoning analysis, put a package together, and then put it out to the development community and see what comes back, because these organizations want to choose the best partner for them, and that's not necessarily like the one who comes with the best balance sheet or the best deals. It's who has the right fit for their mission and their values, and who's going to come correct to them and make sure that the faith-based organization's priorities are driving the project.
Again, we've reached a point now where we are doing that. So we have 3 projects now that have put out RFPs. In this instance, we did use an owner's rep who suggested that idea. So we have in Brooklyn now. By the way, we're not just in Brooklyn. We're in the Bronx. We're in Queens. But we have 3 projects that have put out RFPs themselves, and that's looks like it's going to be a way to mitigate some of the trust stuff that was going on, because they're not just talking to one person, and then it also brings in additional information.
Right.
And because churches, in spite of the perceived disorganizational structure as it relates to real estate and development, they do have missions that are very important to them. They may not be meeting the criteria of, the professionalism of the industry, but they're very sincere. They've helped hundreds and hundreds of people over the years, and it's a great opportunity, in fact, for this marriage to work, particularly with supportive housing. I'm looking forward to it because in a couple of instances, we attempted to do mixed marriages with supportive housing, and the supportive housing aspect caused the project to actually stop, and we're trying to find our way to start it again because of the regulations that go with that, because the focus from the education that we initially got was build as many units as you can, get as much FAR as you can, and so when we start to marry with affordable housing and stipulations and regulations that go with, supportive housing, it cuts down on, in many instances, that perceived objective of build as many units as you can, and so that's an issue now to try and get pastors to understand that. And then the regulations that go with supportive housing, I'm still learning myself. In fact, I was in a meeting where they said that if a certain percentage of the units were of a certain supportive housing area, then they would have a say on who could live in the building. Those are new things for us.
Final 2 questions. I saw a hand here and a hand in the back. Yes. I think you had your hand raised.
My name is Kerman. We're having over time, and we'll say it's both a pleasure, a mission, and a challenge, and history. So I want to just thank the panel here, because the first thing I learned was that it's not only a good spokesperson, it's that you have to go through those archives and figure out the structure of the organization and the hierarchy. There isn't a hierarchy because there is a default hierarchy under New York State law, which may have been discussed, and the Attorney General will need to know to comply with the requirements. And really listening to all the voices from the church. The pastor may be the head of the church, but there usually is a team, and they don't always speak with one voice to know how to make decisions is always the challenge. It's even more a challenge because we work with any kind of joint venture. There's always a strong and weak partner. Being able to work with faith-based groups to make a strong partner is really important.
Yeah. And to that point, I've known many of houses of worship that are in conflict sometimes, even with the pastor, right? Maybe there's a new pastor that just thought about this interesting opportunity to sell land, and there may be a kind of emerging kind of civil war happening inside the house of worship. So I think it's really important to understand, not only have a clear understanding of the pastor's vision, but if you see kind of reluctance or a hesitancy to engage the congregation or the house of worship in general, that may be a red flag. And I speak from experience. My parents were faith leaders, so very kind of familiar with that dynamic. So it's something that people should be really aware of when they engage with these folks. We had a question in the back. Our final question. Interesting. Just to restate, since she was in the back, has anyone on the panel explored the community land trust model? And can anybody comment on that specific? Because I know there's legislation that's trying to be passed, I think, at the local level, but there's several dynamics. I don't know if anyone could speak to that.
Well, I'm familiar with the panel, the community land trust model. I haven't seen a faith community use it, but there's no reason why they couldn't. It basically is, I think, particularly relevant in places like New York City, where long-term affordability is a major issue, and even with, for-profit developed affordable or developed and owned units that may have a 40 or 50-year regulatory agreement, when that period expires, New York City being what it is, they're not making any more land. There's supposed to be another 1 million people moving into the city in the next 30 years. Those units are at high risk of being lost out of the affordable housing stock in 40 or 50 years. So the community land trust model gives an option where that land, the underlying land, will be held, will have affordability restrictions in perpetuity because of the nature of the land trust. So I think it's a very powerful model that has worked in other places. I don't know how much it's been utilized in New York City. I know there's a group out on Long Island, the Uniondale Community Land Trust, that's a startup that's going to focus on that model in their work. They're just about to acquire the first couple of units. So I think it's a very powerful model for preserving affordability over time, over long periods of time.
Excellent. Well, everyone, we want to thank you for joining us in this panel. Please, a final round of applause to each of our panelists.
Jonathan, can I just say that
Absolutely.
You could feel free to email us at kingdomfaithdevelopers@gmail.com if there are any interest in it.
Absolutely, and please don't be shy. Come up, ask questions, and we want to thank you for being here today. Thank you all.